This isn't something you need to think on.
I'll go.
Drive straight to the sheriff's office in Bent Rock. Ask for Nevelson.
Bent Rock?
Sheriff Nevelson.
But what about you?
Just go.
Something's burning. Hey, something's burning, come on!
What the hell is going on?
Bill, the house is on fire. We smelled smoke.
In Montana, a respected retired sheriff named George Blackledge lives blissfully with his wife Margaret, his son James, and his daughter-in-law Lorna. Soon, Lorna and James welcome a baby boy, Jimmy, who brings joy to the Blackledge family and fills their home with warmth and laughter. One morning, James wakes up early and, careful not to wake anyone else, heads out to the stable to complete his morning chores. He takes the new horse out for exercise in the round pen, where he is joined by George, who proudly watches his skills. After spending a few minutes enjoying the peaceful and beautiful morning, George leads James back to the house, where they find Lorna cooking breakfast. As soon as he walks in, James lovingly greets his wife, turns on some music, and starts playing with Jimmy, who fills the house with his adorable laughter. Soon, George joins in on the games and has fun with them. After sharing a family breakfast, George heads out to the stable to do some repairs, while Jimmy takes the new horse out for a ride around their property. Later, seeing how exhausted Lorna is, Margaret advises her to rest while she offers to give Jimmy a bath and spend some time having fun with him. A few minutes later, as she proceeds to dress Jimmy, Margaret is confused to see the new horse trotting back alone. Struggling to control the panic building inside her, Margaret takes a moment to search for James with her eyes. Seeing no sign of him, a terrified Margaret runs out of the house, calling for George and alerting him to the situation. Without uttering a single word, George rushes out to search for James, and after a few minutes, he spots him by a creek. Desperately hoping that he's not too late, George rushes to his son's side to check on him, and is heartbroken to learn that James had fallen off the horse, broken his neck, and died. Unable to comprehend the devastating tragedy that has suddenly befallen his family, George takes a few seconds to bid farewell to his beloved son and takes his body back to the house, where he breaks the painful news to Lorna and Margaret and organizes the funeral. Having lost their only son, Margaret and George do their best to provide the best home for Lorna and Jimmy, whom they love having around. And despite their crushing grief, the Blackledges continue to harmoniously live together and support each other as they navigate life without James. A couple of years later, Lorna decides to marry her new boyfriend, Donnie Weboy, and shares her decision with Margaret and George, who are her only family. Despite having reservations about Donnie, the couple understands Lorna's need to build a life of her own, accept her decision, and promise to always be there for her with whatever she may need. On the wedding day, despite being conflicted by the whole thing, Margaret and George, who are the only guests, attend the ceremony with Jimmy by their side, politely congratulate the newlyweds, wish them a bright future, and return to the farm with their grandson. Soon after, Lorna and Donnie move into a small apartment in town, and, just like they agreed, once they settle down, prepare to welcome Jimmy to live with them. Hence, a few days later, Margaret and George sadly drive their beloved grandson, who has helped them survive their terrible loss, to his new home. There, Lorna and Donnie warmly welcome the Blackledges. Then, Lorna gives them a tour of the apartment, which is still being furnished, and thanks them for driving Jimmy over. Later, Margaret and George bid the young boy farewell, tell him how much they love him, promise to visit him soon, and drive back home, quietly wishing things hadn't turned out the way they did. As soon as the couple gets home and feels the sheer silence, their grief bleeds anew, and they struggle to adapt. Knowing that they need to get used to their new lives quickly, George comforts Margaret by reminding her that Jimmy is still close by, and she can go to town and visit him anytime she wants. A few days later, while shopping in town, Margaret is delighted to see Donnie, Lorna, and Jimmy spending some time together. As she smiles, watching them from her car, the trio gets some ice cream and enjoys themselves until Jimmy accidentally drops his a few minutes later. Then, as Margaret watches in horror, Donnie becomes annoyed by the young boy sulking over the ice cream, aggressively tries to grab his arm, and orders him to keep walking. Hoping to comfort her terrified son, Lorna steps in and tries to calm down the shaken-up Jimmy, but Donnie lashes out at her and hits her. If he does this in public, what is he like behind closed doors? Horrified by what she sees, Margaret quietly drives back home, reflecting on everything she witnessed, starts to panic as she realizes that Lorna and Jimmy are living in an abusive home, and decides to check on their well-being the next day. The next morning, determined to disguise her concern as a surprise casual visit, Margaret goes to Lorna's home with a home-baked cake in hand, and after knocking on the door for a few minutes without getting a response, cheerfully calls out to Lorna to open the door. Moments later, having heard her vain efforts, a neighbor approaches Margaret and informs her that the Weboys had suddenly left town last night and went to live with Donnie's family. Flabbergasted by what she hears, Margaret bombards the neighbor with endless questions before understanding that Jimmy is gone for good. Now, more concerned for Jimmy's well-being than ever, Margaret drives home while trying to figure out how to proceed and decides to do whatever it takes to rescue Jimmy from growing up in such a terrible environment. Hence, Margaret packs up her clothes and everything else she may need on the road, including George's gun, loads it in her car, and waits for George. Later, as soon as George returns home, Margaret explains everything and shares her decision to search and find Donnie and Lorna, reunite with Jimmy, and bring him back to Montana to live with them. Perplexed by everything, George tries to remind his wife that Lorna would never give Jimmy up. Dismissing this, Margaret stands by her decision and gives George a choice to join her or stay back home until she returns with Jimmy. Knowing that there's nothing he can do to change Margaret's mind, George decides to join her as he doesn't want to let her go on the potentially dangerous and unpredictable journey alone. Despite her earlier tone, Margaret is delighted to hear his decision, and the couple prepares to set out on their journey and start driving to town. After a few minutes of driving, knowing that they will be on the road for a while, George takes a detour to visit James's grave and steps out of the car, while Margaret opts to stay back. George spends a few minutes there, quietly thinking about his late son, who he desperately wishes was still with them, and bids him farewell before resuming the drive. Later, the couple head to the sheriff's office in town to speak to Sheriff Nevelson, who is delighted to meet George, whose incredible reputation precedes him in person. The Blackledges explain their predicament and ask the sheriff about the Weboy clan. Sympathizing with them, the sheriff shares that he knows the Weboy clan resides in North Dakota and promises to make some calls and find more information. In the meantime, Margaret and George go out for lunch and enjoy each other's company. However, George accidentally discovers his gun hidden in the car and lashes out at Margaret for bringing it along. Margaret then apologizes, explains that she brought it for protection, thinking she was traveling alone, and calms down her husband, who secures it properly in his luggage. That evening, the sheriff informs the couple that there is a saddlery established by the Weboy clan in Forsyth, advises them to start their search there the next morning, offers to let them stay the night in a clean cell, and provides them with fresh sheets. Later, while chatting with the sheriff, George shares that he's desperate to give Margaret a chance to say goodbye to Jimmy, something she didn't get to do with James. The couple then retire to their makeshift beds early so that they can head out early. But sleep evades George, who spends hours tossing and turning, haunted by memories of James's death before getting up to study their roots. The next morning, the couple head to Forsyth, where they easily locate the saddlery, meet the owner Tucker, share their relationship with the Weboys, reveal that they want to visit their grandson, and ask for their address. Amused by what he hears, Tucker admits that even though he doesn't know Donnie, he is a cousin to the Weboys, and shares that they would have more luck locating them in Gladstone, North Dakota.
Donnie Weboy's married to our daughter-in-law, former daughter-in-law, which makes him stepdaddy to our grandson.
Sure you don't want Gladstone?
Gladstone?
North Dakota? What was your names again?
Any idea who we might ask to find Donnie?
You let it be known you're looking for a wee boy. I'll find you.
This is unnerving. The Blackledges then decide to take some rest from the long drive and take some time to reflect on their progress so far. Despite his decision to accompany Margaret wherever the journey takes them, George gets a bad feeling in his gut that tells him that their quest might not end the way Margaret had desperately hoped. Hence, hoping to protect her from the pain of losing Jimmy all over again, George reminds Margaret that even if Lorna were to give up custody of Jimmy, they are getting too old to raise him on their own, and hence, he might be better off with his new family, and proposes they should head back home. Annoyed by this remark, Margaret asks George to drop her off at the next bus station so that she can continue the journey alone while he returns home and proceeds to go back to the car, until he catches up to her, calms her down, and vows to never leave her side no matter what. A few minutes later, the Blackledges meet a young man named Peter Dragswolf, who, after introducing himself, shares that he lives there in the middle of nowhere. Later, while having tea around a fire, the Blackledges tell Peter about their late son, and fondly share share happy memories before telling him their predicament that has forced them on the journey and asking him if he knows the Weboys. Seemingly terrified to hear the name, Peter tells the couple to first search for a Bill Wellboy when they get to Gladstone and advises them to be careful. The next morning, the Blackledges reach Gladstone, find an address for Bill Weboy, head there, and find him outside. Hoping to get some helpful information on the whereabouts of her grandson, Margaret approaches Bill warmly, cheerfully informs him that they are family, and explains that they're Jimmy's grandparents. However, Bill, who has already been informed of the Blackledges' intention by Tucker, avoids providing any real information and makes annoying jokes until George interrupts him and demands to know Lorna and Donnie's address. Bill quickly changes his tone, reveals that Donnie is his nephew and has moved in with his mother Blanche and now lives on her ranch with his family. Bill then invites the couple into his home and hurries to the back to call Blanche and inform her of the Blackledges' request. Meanwhile, in the living room, George, who's suspicious of Bill and hates his guts, tries to convince Margaret that they don't need Bill's help and assures her that they can try to find the ranch on their own. Moments later, Bill returns to the living room and, to the annoyance of George, informs them that Blanche wants to meet them and has invited them over for dinner. Then, Bill tells them that the ranch is in the middle of nowhere and proposes they should meet at his house later so that they can follow him there in their car. Before George can respond to this, Margaret accepts the dinner invitation, agrees to come back to the house later, and leads her husband out. That evening, as planned, the Blackledges meet Bill at his house, and as they prepare to follow him, Bill approaches them and announces that one of them should drive with him so that he can explain the directions better, and reveals that that's the only way they will understand the roads enough to make their way back on their own. As George fumes over this, Margaret proceeds to step out to join Bill, which further angers him. George tries to stop her from driving with Bill, to no avail, and Margaret quickly gets in Bill's car and they start driving to the ranch. During the drive, despite Margaret's best attempts to ignore all of Bill's inappropriate remarks, Bill continues, making her uncomfortable.
Pretty bird, that old jalopy won't have trouble keeping up with it. Mind? It's your car. You strike me as the kind of woman men are always asking permission on. I've been around more than a few women who want men to ask before. We turn here.
Why don't you signal so George knows what's coming? How much further is it?
Farther.
After a long and exhausting drive, the trio arrives at the ranch and Bill leads the couple into the house. There, George and Margaret meet Blanche, who proudly introduces herself and offers them a drink. Moments later, Blanche randomly announces that she's a fourth-generation Weboy, details that her clan once owned everything north of Gladstone, and starts narrating all the gruesome ways her family members died around the ranch over the years, seemingly believing it will intimidate them. This is so not dinner conversation. Then, as the confused Blackledges wonder when they will get the odd pleasantries over with and get to see Jimmy, Blanche abruptly stops her story and orders Bill to call her two sons, Marvin and Elton, to join them for dinner. A few minutes later, the brothers arrive, and instead of greeting the Blackledges, question them about why they locked their car, as if taking offense at the precaution. George, who's had enough, ignores this and calmly asks Blanche where Jimmy is and is surprised to learn that Donnie had taken him to town to pick Lorna up from her new job. Margaret becomes visibly annoyed by this as she realizes that they could have seen both Lorna and Jimmy in town, away from all the madness.
Lorna?
She's working at Monkey Ward.
Well, we'd certainly hoped to meet Donnie's family someday.
I thought we should meet too. Have ourselves a chat. We better get some food in our bellies before this get-together turns into a real blood.
Who are these people? Who talks like this? Moments later, Lorna, Jimmy, and Donnie arrive at the house, which worsens the already boiling tension. Ignoring this, Margaret lovingly greets Jimmy and is heartbroken to see that the young boy has lost all his cheerful spark and turned into a trembling, scared child. Then, while Donnie scolds Lorna for coddling Jimmy too much, Margaret holds him closely, cherishing each moment she gets with him. Blanche then offers Jimmy, who's already had a burger in town, some dinner, and when he refuses, she scolds him until he thanks her for her offer. Seemingly satisfied by this and completely ignoring the Blackledges, Blanche then orders Lorna to take Jimmy to bed. Shocked by this, Margaret tries to protest and asks to spend more time with Jimmy, but Blanche stands firm. Seeing this and realizing that Blanche is toying with them and enjoying their torment, George gives Margaret a stern look which tells her to relent and put Jimmy down. Feeling defeated, Margaret does so, and as she gives the young boy a hug, seemingly emboldened by his grandparents' presence, Jimmy tells her that his burger had mustard, which he hates, and hence, He hasn't eaten much of it. Terrified by this, Lorna quickly takes Jimmy upstairs, while the heartbroken Blackledges proceed to leave. As the couple gets to their car, Bill runs after them and taunts them, seemingly enjoying their pain. Ignoring this, Margaret and George drive to their motel, quietly crying over the horrifying experience. As soon as they get there, too exhausted to even change their clothes, Margaret and George lie down on their bed. The next day, determined to give their mission one last try, the Blackledges head to the store where Lorna works and try to talk to her. Terrified of getting in trouble and potentially losing her job, Lorna schedules to meet the couple during her lunch break at an establishment across the street and escorts them out. A couple of hours later, the couple meets Lorna, who, as soon as she arrives, apologizes for leaving Montana abruptly and never writing to them. Then, over lunch, the couple asks Lorna about Jimmy, suddenly beaming with pride. Lorna shares how smart her young boy is and details all his recent milestones. Moments later, Margaret boldly informs Lorna of their wish to take Jimmy back to Montana with them and promises to provide him a better future. Outraged by this, Lorna becomes defensive and lashes out at Margaret for her cruel proposal. Unfazed by this, Margaret reveals that she had seen the way Donnie treats her and Jimmy, explains that she doesn't have to live with such abuse anymore, and begs her to join them on their journey back to Montana where they can live happily like before. Straining to control her overwhelming emotions, Lorna shares her fear that if she ever tried to leave, Blanche, who will never let Donnie get away again, will kill both her and Jimmy. She then breaks down, explaining that she doesn't want Jimmy to turn out like them. Glad to hear that she wants to leave the insanity behind, Margaret offers to drive Lorna to the ranch as soon as possible so that they can get Jimmy and drive back home. However, fearing for her life, Lorna turns this down and comes up with a plan to wait until everyone goes to bed that night so that she can sneak out undetected. She promises to meet the Blackledges at 2 a.m. at their motel and warns that they must leave as soon as she gets there. Relieved to have Lorna on board and a plan in place, Margaret and George spend the rest of the day celebrating, enjoying each other's company, and doing everything they can to pass the time. That evening, the couple go out for dinner and spend hours reflecting on everything they have been through over the years, both the good times and the harrowing heartbreaks, and toast to their future with their grandson. Later, the couple return to their motel, wait for Lorna with anticipation, and fall asleep. Then, a couple of hours later, the couple hears a knock on their door, and George cautiously opens the door, but gets the shock of his life as he sees Marvin and Elton on the other side. Before he can react, the brothers barge in and neutralize George, who tries to fight back. Moments later, Blanche and Bill make their way inside. Blanche then starts lashing out at Margaret, whom she believes has crossed a line by trying to come between a mother and a son. Margaret tries to explain herself, and when she fails to convince the fuming Blanche, she reveals that she was forced to get involved after seeing Donnie hit his wife and Jimmy. Seemingly annoyed by this, Blanche slaps Donnie a few times and then, to the shock of the Blackledges, orders him to slap Margaret. After hesitating for a few minutes, Donnie does as ordered and slaps Margaret. Outraged by this, George tries to free himself and come to Margaret's rescue, but he's once again neutralized and thrown to the ground. Then, as Blanche threatens the Blackledges to leave town and never look back, Bill proceeds to take advantage of Margaret, which infuriates George. Desperate to stop Bill, George pulls out his gun, holds Bill at gunpoint, and orders him to leave his wife alone. Unfortunately, moments later, George is attacked and overpowered, and the boys pin him to the wall while Blanche takes his gun. Then, to the Blackledges' sheer terror, Blanche announces that Donnie must teach George a lesson, to never challenge them and pull a gun on them, hands him a hatchet, and orders him to cut off George's hand. While Margaret screams on top of her lungs and begs Donnie not to go through with it, Donnie once again follows Blanche's orders and does as asked. Then, as if nothing out of the ordinary had taken place, the Weboys wish their victims a safe journey home and leave. Devastated and overwhelmed with guilt for putting her husband in such a dangerous situation, Margaret rushes to George's side, tries to help him, and then rushes him to the local hospital. There, George receives emergency treatment, and the doctor alerts the police of the situation. However, the sheriff takes his time and arrives at the hospital to speak to the Blackledges the next morning. Then, after introducing himself, the sheriff reveals that he had already spoken to Blanche, who informed him that the Blackledges had come to town to kidnap Jimmy and tried to attack them, and were only defending themselves. So they went to the motel to defend themselves? Insanity. Without even asking the Blackledges a single question about the incident, the sheriff adds that Blanche had explained to him that George's injuries were accidents, just like the accident that had happened to James.
Their account is that it's Mr. Blackledge here pulled a gun.
In self-defense.
Blanche explained that things got a tad rough persuading you to set your weapon down.
They chopped his hand off.
You know, Blanche, she expressed real concern about how accidents follow your family. If I were giving out advice...
You could save that.
Well, see, I'm thinking of your grandson here.
How low can you go? Then, as the sheriff leaves, he informs the Blackledges that Jimmy is now a wee boy and advises them to leave the area as soon as they can and never look back. The next day, heeding the warning, Margaret packs up their stuff and starts driving George, who's still recuperating, back to Montana. However, after a few hours of driving, George becomes sick and asks her to stop the car so that he can step out and get some fresh air. Seeing his fragile state, Margaret decides to drive to Peter's place only a few miles away, hoping they can take some rest. There, Peter warmly welcomes the couple and helps George inside, where he takes much-needed rest. While George sleeps, Margaret gets to know Peter better and learns that his family lives in North Dakota, and even though he has chosen to live there on his own, he feels quite lonely. That evening, when George wakes up, Margaret, who despite everything refuses to give up on her grandson, proposes that they should permanently move there, build a house on Peter's property, and start a new life so that they can be closer to Jimmy. Haven't you lost enough already, Margaret? Having had enough, George lashes out at Margaret for even considering such a move and reminds her that it won't do them any good, as it's clear that Blanche will never let them see Jimmy. Hearing the truth she has been trying to ignore, Margaret starts crying her eyes out, mourning the loss of both her son and grandson. That night, while everyone sleeps, determined to make Margaret's dream come true, George wakes up, sneaks out of the house, and drives to the Weboys' house. There, George equips himself with a shotgun he finds outside, sets fire to the barn, sneaks into Lorna and Donnie's room, and, while holding Donnie at gunpoint, gives Lorna a choice between staying with her new family or going back to Montana with them. Before he can even finish his question, Lorna chooses to leave the Weboys for good, and hence, George orders her to quickly get Jimmy, leave the house, get to the car parked outside, and leave. As Lorna steps out of the room with Jimmy, she runs into Marvin and Elton, who had been awakened by the smell of the smoke. Completely distracted by this, the brothers run Lorna and Jimmy to find out the source. However, moments later, Bill finds Lorna and Jimmy, becomes suspicious, and as he tries to fight Lorna over Jimmy, Lorna falls down the stairs. Meanwhile, George hits Donnie, who tries to alert his family to what's going on, and knocks him out. Then, George quickly steps out of the bedroom, holds Bill at gunpoint, and forces him to release Jimmy. Suddenly disturbed by the commotion, Blanche wakes up, sees what's going on, and with a gun drawn tries to confront George, who becomes distracted and loses control of the shotgun, which falls down the stairs. Then, as Bill proceeds to attack George, Blanche tries to shoot George, but accidentally shoots and kills Bill. Without even pausing to acknowledge what had just occurred, Blanche orders George to release Jimmy. Despite being held at gunpoint, George boldly defies Blanche, throws Jimmy over the balcony till Lorna catches him, and starts running out for her life. Furious, Blanche shoots George in the side of his chest. Moments later, Blanche calls out to Marvin and Elton, who come running up the stairs, and as she orders them to chase Lorna, George summons all his strength to drag himself up, attacks Blanche, and as they fight over the gun, he forces her to fatally shoot both Marvin and Elton. The irony of Blanche taking out all the Weboys. Meanwhile, having noticed George's disappearance and knowing where he will likely be, Peter and Margaret go to the Weboy house and are surprised to find Lorna running for her life. Margaret calms down Lorna, tells her to stay with Peter, and frantically runs to the house hoping to find George. Once there, Margaret takes the shotgun, carefully searches for her husband around the house, and finds him gravely injured. Relieved to have gotten there just in time, Margaret rushes to George's side, helps him up, carefully takes down the stairs, and is relieved to find Peter waiting for her. Then, just as Peter and Margaret help George out of the burning house, Blanche appears out of nowhere and proceeds to shoot Margaret. Seeing this, George pushes his beloved wife out of the way, gets shot, and drops to the ground. Terrified out of her mind, Margaret reacts quickly, shoots and kills Blanche, rushes to check on George, and is devastated to learn that he's succumbed to his injuries and died. Heartbroken, Margaret slumps over her husband's body and cries her eyes out until Peter drags her out of the house, which soon goes up in flames. Once outside, Margaret, Lorna, and Peter watch as the fire completely engulfs the horrifying legacy of the Weboys. Later, the trio starts their journey back, and after a few hours, Margaret thanks Peter for everything he has done for her and drops him off. Then, while shedding quiet tears, Lorna and Margaret start driving back to Montana. Feeling lighter than ever for the first time in months, Lorna opens her window and enjoys the fresh air, while Margaret, who's devastated by the loss, continues crying, already missing her beloved husband, who had sacrificed everything for his family.